Yes, but I never act as a critic without, for example, visiting a building first. I refuse point blank to write about a project I haven't seen or haven't visited. I just don't think that it makes sense. I mean, it's why in reviewing work, I have some difficulty in reviewing proposals for projects because they're not yet real. And I also have a difficulty with reviewing finished projects simply by photographs. That's a staged representation of a project that has been presented to me. And I prefer, I mean, my method is first to go and talk to the architect or to read the architect's text, but ideally to go and talk to the architect about their intentions. Then to visit, and I don't mind whether I visit alone or visit with the architect, that's not an issue. But I do require then, once we arrive at a site, I require time to, as I call it, to stalk the building. I will walk its perimeter at least once, maybe a couple of times, see how the sun affects it at different times of the day, then go in and then explore the project, measure it against what the aspirations, as explained to me by the architect, were, and come away and think as hard and as deeply as I can about it and before I write it. So to do a building review takes at least a week in the way that I work. And I'm not happy doing it any other way. You know, when I was younger and I would visit a city, for example, you know, there would be a series of projects you'd go and see. Now I make it a point of principle that if I go to a city on holiday, on my own time, for example, I will go to see only one thing. And I will never, ever use a camera. I stopped using a camera about 15 years ago because what I found was that using it, I will use a camera, I will use a camera sometimes as an aide-memoire. But what I found was, or how I reacted to using a camera while being on a site was that I was postponing the act of looking. I actually was framing photographs and I was then trying to experience the building when I got home of two-dimensional prints. And instead I've said, to hell with that, and just sit there and try and absorb the space and try and remember what it felt like to be in the space. So I went to Berlin and I spent a whole day in Egon Armand's Kurfürstendammstraße Gedächtniskirche, Kaiser Wilhelm Gedächtniskirche. I've been twice, once in winter, once in summer, to see Peter Zumthor's Bruder Klaus Kapelle. Simply just, you need time. I find, at least I find, I need time in space to understand architecture.
Shouldn't that just be the way it's done?
Well, each to their own.
I know.
But the world moves fast, and I mean, I was lucky at a time 20 years ago, 25 years ago, when I was approached by the Sunday Times to write for them. That I was given freedom to choose which projects I wished to write about. And we would agree the project at least 10 days in advance of publication to give me time to go and see it, give the picture editors time to gather the photographs and so on. And, you know, that was a gift. But, you know, if you work now for a newspaper, you know, you're expected to have a blog, you're expected to have a tweet, you're expected to have an Instagram account, and you're expected to be on it now. And I think criticism today, I mean, I don't ever believe the perennial story that criticism is in crisis. You know,
You don't believe that?
No, 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 no. Because that goes back at least 3,000 years. You know, some of the oldest texts in the world that exist today describe buildings. So criticism, you know, it's always had its problems, but it's always sustained itself. Writing about buildings will never finish. The modus and the medium may change a little bit, and it will become deeper or shallower as people are more philosophical or more click-driven.
Superficial, yeah.
You know, but the buildings are there, and the amazing thing is the texts last longer than the buildings. The texts always outlive the buildings. So they are important. It's difficult to make a living today, I think, to write about architecture. And I think it's actually impossible to write at speed. Like I hate these sites like Dezeen and you know, what other ones?
Well, the zine is really the kind of the embodiment of everything that's
shit.
wrong.
Yeah. Absolutely, because
yeah.
I mean, all they do is they take a press release from a PR agent who has taken some headline notes from a project architect and cobbled together something, and they put it out with photographs, and their aim is to be first. That's the only aim, to be first, not to be good. It's like, I suppose, the old Miesian maxim, you know, I don't want to be interesting. I would much prefer to be good. So, you know, I take no part in that whole, I have no Twitter account, I have no Instagram account, I have no Facebook account, I have no website. To me, it's all meaningless. Plus, also, when I have built websites on 2 occasions, for example, when I was commissioner for the Irish entry at the Venice Biennale, both those websites have gone. There's nothing there except the paper printout I made of them. Paper survives. You know, we think paper burns. You know, people burn books. Books rot. They're eaten by pests. They're much better if they're in multiples, like a print run, because their chance of survival is much greater. But actually, they are much more durable than anything electronic. And even if you can preserve the electronic links, you know, the electromagnetic images and way of representing words and pictures is decaying in time anyway. You know, in the way that a piece of paper is it'll fade, but it's relatively stable.
I think
the digital world is not stable, and I guess this is why I admire architects like Shane LeBlanc. I hate architects like Rem Koolhaas and Danny Libeskind and Zaha Hadid.
What's well, before we get to them, before we get to the architects, I just want to, you said so many interesting things, and I'm falling into a trap of an interview format, as if this is going to get published. So I'm doing this thing that I would do if we were to publish this.
I have done it many times myself, so I know what you're at.
But let's just do it, because I think let's just do it, because who knows? Who knows?
Who knows? I might relent.
Yes, yes. If I send you an edit and then you like it, who knows what might happen. But anyway, the point is, I think maybe the first point that I'd like to explore just a little bit further and just elaborate on is the point that you make about images in relation to words, and that maybe the crisis, well, you say that there may not be necessarily crisis in architectural criticism, but I guess the kind of monopoly of the zine puts an emphasis on an image in broadly in culture. So the monopoly of the zine and the monopoly of, let's say, Instagram focus all the attention into the image, perhaps more than ever before in the history. I also, it was, I think, in the Master and Margarita, there was a line that manuscripts never burn, I think, if I remember well. And so I really enjoyed that reflection, reiterating Bulgakov. But yeah, I don't know, is image a danger?
No, because I think it's transient, I think it's probably, it's no more substantial than a dream. We are much more in our waking conscious, active, purposeful lives than we are in our dream world. We need our dream world. We need those images. They are powerful to us, but we forget our dreams. We'll forget those images. It's the deliberate thoughtful response through words to what is built, to the world around us, that will endure. Images become historical curiosities. It's like, looking at, when I was training as an architect in the 1970s, we looked at the œuvre complète, Le Corbusier was on our desks, and among others. But we grew up with an image of modernity as black and white was modern. And then you go to Pessac, or then you go to the Waisenhofsiedlung, and you find that actually it was just a technical limitation of photography at the time that presented the world to you in black and white, and the reality was totally different. So the images were powerful, they were stimulating, but they weren't real. But what was written by Le Corbusier, or what was written by Alfred Roth in the Zwei Wohnhäuser, the Waisenhofsiedlung project book, that remains true. That is the intention of the architect. Those words haven't changed over time, whereas our appreciation of the images has changed over time.
So have you ever, in any circumstance, been interested in the image?
Yes, as an ideal.
Okay.
It is an ideal. And I think it's interesting when an architect finds a photographer who they believe understands their work, and they always work with the same photographer. Because that's a powerful link, but that's about the ideal, in the same way that, let's say, or in a different way than, let's say, Lucan would have said, that the project deteriorates from the moment you start building it. It's much better when it's a proto-ruin before it becomes a reality, and it degrades at every point after that through time. So the ideal is earlier than the completed building. I think that architects and photographers, when an architect finds a photographer who understands their work and vice versa, I think you can establish the ideal intent for the work. But you have to know that architecture exists in time, and everything degrades in time, or if not degrades, acquires a patina. So it is changed through time, and the architect
it's occupied as well.
The architect must release the building, and the architect usually releases the building at the opening and goes away content with ideal photographs of an empty vessel, before any human interaction has been imposed upon or invited into that structure. So that's one kind of moment. But I think that critics have another role. We know that the architect must surrender the building, and they sign off on it, and that's it. And it then is literally handed over by contract law to its owner and to its occupiers. But in that same period or around about that same time, the critic has a role to play. And I don't know if you've read my works, but I mean, one of my views about the role of the critic is that one analogy would be to say, well, let's say the architect or architects are the parents of the baby. So they've had a baby, right? Well, what do you have to do 6 or 7 days after the baby is born? Let's say in Christian faith, but I'm sure there are similarities in other faiths and cultures around the world. The baby is brought to church to be given a name, to be given an identity. In a way, the baby is an open vessel, an empty vessel, doesn't yet have a name. And who gives it the name? Of course, it's the priest, or in Christian ritual, the priest baptizes the baby and I name you whatever. And that's the name you are known to society as thereafter. It's not the parents who give the name. Culturally, religiously, socially. It's through this liturgy or through this ritual. And I think the critic plays a similar role with architecture. That when the architect has given birth to the baby, if you like, to the building, the critic names it. The critic introduces the work to society, opens the dialogue, opens the discussion, frames how this building will be understood forevermore. And that's the role of the critic. So it's a really important role that the critic plays in relation to the architect. And it's not subservient to the architect. It's not in the employ of the architect. It's actually as an intermediary between society now and in the future, and this new creation which is coming to the world.
I guess is it too early for a critic to evaluate the creation only a few days after the birth?
I think the critic starts the conversation. It becomes a never-ending conversation. I'm sure people will be talking later this evening about the Eiffel Tower. The early critical viewpoint of it was I have lunch there every day because it's the only place in Paris where I can't see it. But the view today will be that half the world will be watching the Eiffel Tower and gazing in wonderment at the French Republic, I hope, in a happy ceremony that has no disasters attached to it, apart from the arson that's already happened on the rail lines. But, the conversation was begun by a critic. That it's where I would have lunch because it's the only place in Paris where I can't see it. So the conversation evolves. But the conversation is not led or even directed by the architect. The architect is now gone from the picture. The object must now stand for itself. It must be imbued with all the thoughts and all the time and care that was put into it by the architect and the design team and the construction team. But it now belongs to all of us. And the conversation is open.
What's the oldest building that you critiqued, or what's the building that lived longest before you went and assessed its character?
Gee, that's a tough question. That's a tough question. I've never written about the pyramids, about Rome. I've been to both, of course, but I have to.
Because I wonder whether
I might have written about Newgrange, but not seriously.
Mm-hmm.
It's probably 18th century, late 18th century
Mm-hmm.
in Ireland.
Mm-hmm. And so and also
almost all my writing is about Ireland because that's where I am. Do you know,
yes,
if I was
yes,
living in Austria, I'd be writing about Austrian buildings.
absolutely, and it goes back to your earlier point that you have to be there,
Yeah.
physically. But then I guess maybe a kind of another version of that question could be, what's the building that you revisited since since the building was built? And let's say you might have had an initial impression when the building was built, and then you might have revisited it years later and formed a different impression. Is there anything like that? Or maybe even there might be something of there might be a Shane's project that would have been read differently.
Mostly it's a sad story. Mostly it's about physical degradation or brutal amputations or operations that have taken place on the body of the building. So I would, for example, have known the Fairhouse Church in its earliest incarnation. You know, I knew it when it was only a drawing, when it was only a competition scheme concept drawing.
Yeah.
I knew when it was
without the site.
Without the site, exactly.
Yeah.
But an idealized site. So it had the configuration of a walled garden with a cruciform within it. I mean, the form was already clear, but there was no site given in the competition. I then remember it as a series of working drawings done by a classmate of mine in fine pencil, and an amazing series, beautiful series of coloured renderings in coloured pencil done by John Marr. I then remember going to it as a construction site. I remember going to it when it opened first. It was raw and bleak. It was like a pillbox, because none of the growth had come up around it or anything like that. Nobody knew what was inside. There was just this little shelter, 4 columns, little shelter at the one door of one of the elongated gardens, that gave any clue. Then I remember passing it regularly. It was a road I knew well and had to travel from time to time in Fairhouse, seeing the ivy or whatever growing on the outside, dropping in from time to time. When it was built first, it had no furniture. It just had plastic chairs inside. And the reason for that was that the budget had been overspent. And Shane de Blackham was of the view that parishioners would eventually find enough money to have pews. So just give them plastic chairs for now, put the money into the building. The timber was unvarnished on the outside. It later became varnished. It was silver grey, you know, like in Scandinavia, like in Norway. It had silvered out. So I've seen it in those various stages. And then this pitched roof was put on top. The metal pitched roof was put on top. And you kind of say to yourself at that stage, is the building dead or can it survive? I think the gardens have kept it alive. So, but mostly when I go back to buildings, it's about all the things how it has been mistreated, how a building has been. It's not just, you know, the infirmity of age. It's the injury of brutality. That's what hurts the most.
Yeah, and I think they also painted the concrete structure.
Yeah, originally concrete was plain fine grey concrete, and the only decoration on it was the Stations of the Cross, which were in gold leaf. Just they weren't pictorial. they were numerical, but they were in gold leaf applied on concrete. And then, you know, someone says, let's paint this. That's also, you know, things that disappear, you know, tapestries that disappear, baptismal fonts that are conscious that disappear from the one over in the west in Mayo and Knock. You know, buildings have a tough life.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, buildings give so much love, but they are loved very little in return most of the time. They're not appreciated, and that's also, I think, a fault. That's a failure of criticism. I think that, you see, I think the criticism is actually not a kind of for me at least, it's not an academic discourse. It is, of course, but it is first and foremost for me. It's a matter of communication. It's of being. Let's say again. I mean, I'm not a religious person. I was born into a religious family, but I haven't been religious for decades. I don't believe in any of that stuff. But again, if you go back to a time in the Middle Ages, let's say, in Europe, one of the roles of a priest in a church would have been to explain what the gospel was through the pictures that were in the stained glass, through the reading in the book, because his audience, by and large, was illiterate. So he had to explain these things and why they were important. And I think that's the noble, for me, that's the noble calling of criticism. If it can broaden the audience, you know, in a way that we can all be quite informed and not afraid to make readings and opinions about books or films we've seen. But most of our colleagues who are not in the architecture world wouldn't dare to presume to put an opinion out about a building like that, because they would say, I don't know anything about this. I even remember, like, in 1980 when we had an exhibition in Dublin, and there was no architecture critic writing in any of the national media, but there was a good, I wouldn't say very good, but a good art critic writing in the Irish Times, which is a serious paper. It's a paper of record. And he started off by saying, I don't presume to know enough about architecture to say anything about this exhibition. You know, so that nobody felt confident enough that they had the words or the understanding to know what architecture was about. Whereas they would have no problem with film, they'd have no problem with music, they'd have no problem with fiction. And I think we as critics have a job to do there. Open that breach.
Yeah, I asked, I remember I was at the AA talking to a colleague, let's say, and a very senior colleague. And the colleague said that they went to see the Serpentine Pavilion in Hyde Park. And I asked them, did you like it? And it was like the most surprising question. I didn't really get the answer. And I really was left with the kind of bitter taste that we are not really able to articulate, even on a superficial level, you know, whether we liked it, whether we had any kind of positive impression of it.
You know, you go to a concert, were you moved?
Yeah.
You know, nobody has to tell you who the composer was or what. You know, it affects you. And of course, if you walk into a building, it affects you. If you just open your eyes and pause for a little while, but we have a job to do.
Yeah.
That's why I think there's no crisis in criticism. We haven't even started with what a huge part of our mission could be. People who are able to articulate to a general public why.
And I think another question before I ask you about that statement, that you like Shane as an architect, Shane de Blackham. But before we get to that statement, because I think that's where I cut this conversation. But before we get there, I'd just like to go back once again to your initial explanation as to how you approach a building that you're writing about. And I really enjoyed that you said that you walk around it twice or 3 times, and then you go in. And to me, it sounds that it's almost a filmic experience. I feel like maybe comparison to photography, comparing the experience to, let's say, a cinematic experience is more fitting than comparing it to a kind of still image. But what are you looking for in this walk around?
First of all, I'm looking for flaws, inconsistencies, little things that got away. How it impacts on its neighbours. Does it care about its neighbours? But also, is the back as good as the front? And if not, is that acceptable given the condition of the surroundings at the back compared to the condition of the surroundings at the front? But I guess it's more to do with, ultimately it's to do with, I mean, this sounds very highfalutin, space and time. It's about space. It's like, let's say, 2 dancers moving around each other or something like that, you know? You want to see all sides. You want to see the back of the head as well. You want to see as a knife being carried in the, you know, the back pocket or whatever, or a gun. You want to know who you're engaging with, and what their character is like. And that's how we kind of judge people. You know, you would ideally like to circle a person before you embrace them, because then by then you kind of know. But it's also about time, and by time, I guess there's two aspects to that. One is a respect for the amount of time the architect and the design team have put into making this. That you don't go make a snap judgment. This usually has taken years of thought. It's been chipped away at the edges. Some of the idealism has been knocked off it in the process. But it has taken a long time. And I actually think that buildings, the longer a building takes in design and construction, the better chance it has to survive for a long time afterwards. I think time invested.
Absolutely.
Very slowly. And to do things very quickly, they erode very quickly. And I think you owe that respect to the project and to its begetters to give it time as well. But it's also that by moving slowly, you get into, it's a similar state that I get into sometimes when I'm writing really well. And a sentence comes and a word just arrives, and you know, you've moved on a paragraph without even thinking about it. It just flowed naturally. And I think that by going slowly through a building, you open yourself to that happening to you while you're there, and the impression and the memory and the observation and the understanding or enjoyment of the thing it is you've come to visit.
Mm-hmm. Is it important for a critic to have had practiced, drawn details, understood the effort and care that goes into, you know, aligning a brick to a concrete base or something like that?
Well, for me, it's essential.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I mean, I trained as an architect. I built a building or two, and that has been very important for me. But I won't say that you couldn't do it without it, you know. But you know, Ken Frampton, you know, was a project architect of apartment buildings in London and technical editor of AD before he became an academic. Joseph Rickard, I'm not sure, but I think the other way it benefited me. I don't want to speak about other people. I think everyone there's no door closed anywhere. Do you know Rainer Bannerman, for example? I don't think ever had any architectural training or anything like that. Ian Nairn certainly didn't. Jane Jacobs didn't. But they all had great things to say that we can all learn from. So the door is not closed in that way. But what I found, and maybe it was part of a small community, a small culture, a particular generation in a particular place, but maybe I know something similar has happened with a colleague of mine, Marc Dubois in Ghent, in Flanders. By having been an architect, by having, you know, I was part of Group 91, the building I designed in my own right with my partner, Michael Kelly, who later worked with the Black Mamar, you know, won the AI Downs Medal, was the AI Building of the Year, got an RIBA European Architecture Award, was nominated for the Mies van der Rohe Award.
And what building was that?
That was the ARC Children's Cultural Centre in Temple Bar. Finished in 95. The awards all flowed in 96 and the years afterwards. But what it meant was the likes of Shada Blackham or John Michel O'Donnell or Shelley McNarney von Farrell, they saw me as an equal architect. That I had been designing buildings at the same time as them, to the same level that they were aspiring to build to. That it meant, I think that they spoke to me differently than they would have spoken to someone who, you know, had no track record or understanding of a site. You know, like I had to condemn work. You know, we had major problems with the builder that they all knew about. We had to handle all of those sort of things. We had huge cuts to the budget after the tenders came in, before we went on site, and how do you save the building in those circumstances? The people I was writing about knew that about me. So they could open up to me in a way when they would talk to know I knew what they were talking about. I knew how hard it was to get a project off paper into the ground. So that helped. That helped. So yes, I think for me, it was essential that I had a background. Also, my parents were architects, so I'd had that kind of growing up, you know.
But maybe that's why you say that alongside going to visit the building, one of the first things that you would do is also talk to the architect. And it's interesting that, because if we think of Shane de Blackham, he says and repeats multiple times that it's of no consequence what an architect says about their project. And so if that's the case, then I guess it's all left to you.
Shane is being, I think, philosophical, and he says, and not wholly true, not wholly truthful. It is true that he has written almost nothing in the years since, I think it was 1969. He graduated, maybe it was a little bit earlier even. 69, I think he graduated from UCD, and then went to America. yes, he has written almost nothing. But then he has said almost nothing as well. He taught me for 2 years. He was my year master in first year in college in 1973-74, and in third year in college in 1975-76. And there was an interesting difference between the two. In 73-74, he was back a year. He had been teaching for 1 year before in UCD, and this was the first time he ran the course. And he had built nothing. He had been part of Chamberlain, Powell and Bond's office in London, but not on the Barbican. He was in the other team, not on the Barbican team. So he understood how a very large office worked at. And he had then gone to Philadelphia, to Penn, and he'd moonlighted in Lou's office as a student, meaning he worked for free. And he, because Kimball was on site at the time and was the project in the office, the A team was on Kimball. So Shane was part of the team that was on the Yale building. And he eventually became the kind of project architect after the first scheme had run wildly over budget and been rejected. He became kind of he was project architect. So he would go to meetings with just him and Lou, and they would go to meetings with the president of Yale, in Yale and at the Yale Club in New York. They would go, because it was the Mellon Center, they would go down with Paul Mellon. They would fly down to Paul Mellon's estate in Virginia, where he had his ranch and his horses and all of that, and all of that, and meet with him. So he'd been exposed at an extremely high level, and during that period to clients, important clients, institutional clients. That's very important, because that's what shapes Shane. He only really ever works for institutions afterwards.
And it's John Marr. It's John Marr who actually does private client work.
John does the private clients, and at times I think John's private clients probably kept the office alive.
Absolutely, yeah.
You've seen these two books.
Yes, I don't have them, but I think I've read.
In the essays in them.
Yes, I think I've read an essay from one of those. Yes.
There's a big interview. There's a long interview.
Oh yes, and I read your interview that was in the Venice Biennale document. He's
very charming, but like I've lost the thread of things a little bit here. But we're talking about the first year when he was teaching me.
Yeah.
And he had been very absolutely directly involved in reworking the second scheme. In other words, the scheme that would go to tender for the Yale Center, the Mellon Center at Yale, before he came back to Ireland. And he left as that package of drawings was finished and before the project went on site. But what he learned in America was that, first of all, he learned about institutional plans, and that shaped his life ever after. He also learned about the power of the drawing. That in America, the contract documents are the drawings. The drawings and the specification. Whereas in Europe, a contract document is the bill of quantities. Bill of quantities is drawn up by the quantity surveyor, and that's what runs a contract here in Ireland and over with you in the UK. In America, there's no bill of quantities. It's the working out of all of that is a collaborative process between the builder and the architect. And it's the set of drawings that are the dominant tool. So Shane has always believed in the power of drawing, even though it's not a natural fit in our legal construction system. So drawings were terribly important. So he had us drawing 1 to 5 brick details. axonometric brick details of different bonds of projects by Mies, and just even different brick bonds. He had us making timber models. He had us making plasticine models of landscapes. All the things that were done in Lou's office, he transposed directly into our first year studio.
Mm-hmm.
By the time we got to third year, and he was a full-time teacher at that stage, he had never built anything. During our first year, there was a competition in Tipperary, in the south of Ireland, North Munster, north of Cork, for a post office. It was an open competition, post office building. Hard to believe now, no one would be building post office buildings anymore. But he entered that in 1974. So he was starting to look to see about practice and things like that. And then he hooked up with John Marr. And it's amazing, they'd both been in Philly at the same time. John had, they were a year, 18 months age difference between them. John had been at Bolton Street, Shane had been in UCD. They'd never met in Dublin. Shane was in Lou's office. John Marr called to see if he could get a job in Lou's office, but was sent down the road to work with Bob Venturi instead, who had been in Lou's office. So John was with Venturi, Roque, and Scott Brown down the office, and they only met when they got back to Dublin and were on the Architectural Association of Ireland committee, the ARC committee. They got together and they did the church. Then there was in '76 there was the church competition, and they did entries for that. And John won 2 prizes. There were 2 premiums, so they were awarded 2 churches. Now they entered them separately. Shane took over the Fairhouse Church, but it was actually John's design. And Shane will deny this to this day, but he wrote it in a journal called Introspect, which existed for only 3 issues. But in 1976, Shane wrote about the church competition, 2-page article. Maybe it was 4-page article. Maybe it was 4-page article. It was a large format called Introspect. But in it, he talks about John's 2 wins and John's two manners, because the churches were quite different from each other. But by the time we got to third year, Shane was now, it was 75, 76, so he was now thinking about practice and gearing up to practice, and it was a good bit different from we saw the idealist in our first year, and we saw someone who was trying to find himself in a new world in our third year. But all of this began because you said, I think, something about Shane not believing in the word. He didn't speak much, so crits were really unusual with Shane. He had a very powerful personality, and he doesn't say much, but people, when they kind of meet him, tend not to speak first. Do you know? You've met him.
Yes.
Yeah, he has an aura about him, and we would maybe have a crit or a project review, and there might be 5, 6, 7 people in the front row in a kind of a Yale style review. There'd be, with invited guests from London and wherever and everything like that. And I always remember in third year, he had us, and there was a schools competition on that year, which he was entering. He didn't win, but he set it for us, and it was beyond our capacity. It was too big. It was a school for 810 students, and we just on an urban site, and we just didn't have the skill to really deal with it at that stage. A lot of us struggled, and I struggled particularly badly. And I hung up my work, made my explication of it, and stood beside the drawings on the wall. And there were about 7 people in the jury, the whole class, and that sort of thing. And Shane just looked at his shoes. And I was the only person who, you know, watching. He was on the left front of the row. He just looked down at his shoes. And I was scanning the room. And I could see some raised eyebrows at the back of the room from my classmates. And then I could see puzzlement among the other invited critics, because nobody knew what to say. Nobody was going to say anything until they got their cue from Shane. Incredible to see him absolute silence, and nobody would say anything. And he must have held it for about 5 or 6 minutes. And then I always remember he just went, "Time for coffee." And everybody stood and walked out of the studio. Not a word said about my project. None of the critics were going to venture saying anything until they knew how Shane had responded to it. My project was terrible, by the way. It was really terrible. It didn't warrant much of a discussion. But like, Shane was like that. He wasn't even vocal in crits, and he wasn't vocal at the drawing board. So the words is not simply a written thing. It was just, you know, he wanted a library atmosphere in our studio. I was the bad boy in charge of the record player in the corner. So like, we didn't get on at all. You know, he was hot and mad because I would have a multi-stack in the old days, a multi-stack LP record player in the studio. And he wanted just silence. He wanted it like a Benedictine monastery or whatever, and a scriptorium, and everybody just scratching. Only sound you'd hear was scratching of pens. But he was very precise about things like, if you're making a cardboard model, you had to have scalpel blades, and you couldn't make more than 3 cuts with the scalpel blade, and then throw it away, because after that you had blunted it.
Yeah, you're butchering the paper.
You're crushing the card. Yeah, and so throw it away, throw it away, throw it away. So, you know, he was, yeah, very firm like that. But it's true, he hasn't written much. He was asked, there's a thing called, a journal called Building Material.
Yes, oh right, I saw that. I think edited by Peter Carroll.
Peter Carroll, that's it. And Peter was doing an essay, a journal, an edition of the journal on teaching and learning. And Shane basically kind of did a 1-page letter back to him saying, you know, he says, I have a real difficulty with writing about architecture. I'm not able to do it. It takes forever. Also, I'm not sure that it matters what an architect says about another's work. When I was teaching, and then Khan was a nice man. But I have found him in interviews, and there are several that I've written. I mean, every time I've written about them, every time I've written about his work, I have gone to speak to him about it first. And I found that he is actually quite talkative.
He is.
He is quite talkative when he wants to be. I mean, he will either just refuse you point blank, or he will indulge you the whole way. So I've been fortunate he's trusted me, even though, you know, as a student, I was a bête noire, a poor student and a disruptive student in the corner of the studio. But I found him to be wholly honest and open in what he says. You know, surprising things like he would get us to draw 1 to 5 axonometrics of brick corner details, complex brick corner details, you know, 13.5-inch walls, not cavity walls, with different bonds and everything. And he would tell us, he would always say that the brick must be in an arch. You know, none of this steel lintel and, you know, a header course of bricks across. You know, he said, you know, that's just not how you build with bricks, because it's not the brick that's important. As he would often say, it's not the brick that's important, it's the wall. So the wall is what's all important to Shane. So, for example, the mortar and the thickness of the mortar joint is as important as, like, he would think that idea of going off and through a catalogue, picking half a dozen brick samples and bringing them to the planning officer for approval is bonkers, because that's not what the wall will look like.
Absolutely.
It won't look like the brick, because it's the combination of the mortar, the thickness of the mortar, and the brick that makes the wall. And it's the
hundreds of bricks, and also hundreds of bricks of different colors.
And it's the wall that's important.
Mm-hmm.
Do you know? So like I would get itchiness when I was working with brick. When the engineer would say we have to put an expansion joint in here, or a contraction joint, or whatever, you know, because the concrete frame and the brick, or one of them is shrinking and the other's expanding, and you've got to have a movement joint here, or you're going to get crack lines somewhere. And I'd be fighting like crazy to get rid of these things, you know. And I know Shane would hate those, because that's not what a wall is. You're doing something wrong. You just know you're fundamentally doing something wrong if you end up having to be in that territory.
Mm-hmm.
Either the mortar is too hard, or, you know, whatever. You should be using lime mortar instead of cement mortar. But you just know you're doing something wrong.
Mm-hmm.
He would have guided us very clearly on that. He would have spoken a little bit about the importance of the institution as an organizational, social, human construct that created society, that was at the bedrock of society. So, like, John Maher would have been totally different. I mean, the last essay in the last book that was published, I mean, these are just a collection of essays over the years. You know, I was just writing about John Maher when John had died. I was talking about the color white or whatever. Then candles on a table, of course. John loved tables in the way Shane loves the institution. Each at the center of life, of coming together, separated only by scale, from a circle of friends to the cradle of society.
Mm-hmm.
So Shane would have operated at that large, that's why he loved universities, you know, and libraries. And he'd have worked at that large social level. John Maher was convivial. He would be the last person to leave. You know, I mean, he would be. I bumped into him one night. One of the last times I saw him was in Venice, just literally by the Rialto, and he was in a restaurant, and the waiter was trying to get rid of, you know, shut up shop and everything like that. John says, he was in his white linen sitting. Come on. He said, Joe. And he insisted on another bottle being opened, and he just insisted on the restaurant staying open until 2 in the morning just to serve him and me, because he couldn't stop. He was convivial. You know, Shane's not convivial. Shane would dodge the party. John would be at the heart of the party. So John, like, was brilliant at that personal, social collective. Shane is a genius at the institutional collective. Mm-hmm. And he would, when we were kids, have spoken to us about, you know, one of the important things. He'd have spoken of rooms, about the importance of rooms and gardens and institutions. Those would be words he'd have used a lot. A room is a room, you know, and it has light that comes into it. It has proportions. It has materials that make it. A sequence of rooms. It is something like he'd never be talking about open plans or things like that. A room was important. And an important room that would be lined with books or something like that should have a garden with it, that the garden and the room were very closely connected.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. One thing that
Talk about those fundamentals. Do you know?
Yeah, but you know, one thing I think he really enjoyed talking about, and one thing that he spoke to us about for hours, was Dublin. You know, then of course I realized that each of his lectures, the few of them that are out there in the world, all begin by him explaining Dublin. But he also insisted that we need to understand Dublin. So he took us on a long ride. We were with him in a car for 3.5 hours.
Wow.
Driving around Dublin, which was really special. But yeah.
What did he show you? Outsides, insides?
Yeah, he didn't take us to Casino Marina,
Okay.
but he took us to the Phoenix Park. That's probably the furthest place.
Further west, yeah.
Yes, and he showed us this field where the Taoiseach's house competition was.
That I have said that is the great lost project of 20th century Irish architecture. The great loss.
Their particular project, or in general
their particular project. No, the Shalliff and Evans project wasn't as interesting, and Julian Wickham's project was terrible. But Julian Wickham's father-in-law, Aldo Fenech, was on the jury, so I think that's why Julian Wickham got in there. But Shane and Johns was an enormous loss. That was all about the institution. It was about, there were lots of libraries. There was the Taoiseach's private library, that's the Prime Minister's private library. There was a library in the State Guest House, but all the libraries were connected with their own gardens.
And it was a big square, and the site was flat and vast. Yeah. So then we went, he took us to the Henrietta Street, and I think the rest of our tour was really around central Dublin.
You've just reminded me that when we were in first year, and this was very unusual at the time, he used to organize Saturday morning trips where we had to go with our sketchbooks. So he brought us to St. Mary's Abbey, which is now a Greek Orthodox church. It's now, because the city has risen around it, it's now totally underground. It's off Abbey Street. So he brought us there. It's kind of, I would say, it's 14th century, something like that. Oldest structures in the city. He brought us there. He brought us to Henrietta Street. He brought us to Townley Hall, which is up outside Drogheda. Has a wonderful cantilever stone staircase, elliptical stone staircase, oval shaped. He brought us to, I mean, this is like at the height of, this is before Pomo. This is long before Pomo. The modernists were only barely dead. Not all of them were dead. I mean, and
had that, let's call it brutalist library in the Trinity College been built?
It had, yes, by Paul Carlick. Yes, that had been built.
Would he take you there? Because he actually said that that's one of the most important buildings.
Well, everyone says that's one of the most important buildings. Neil McLaughlin wrote about it as his most important, informative building in the HA. John Toomey has almost tried to own it. I've filmed, but been able to complete the film of the interview with Paul Carlick. It was Peter Ahrens and Paul Carlick who designed it. Paul Carlick who designed it. He designed it in New York, on the kitchen table of his small flat in New York while he was working for Marcel Breuer. And in the final draw-up, the night of the final draw-up, he brought in Richard Meyer to help finish off the drawings. So Richard Meyer helped with the competition entry. But Paul was my thesis tutor. So I filmed with Paul about it. Everybody has tried to own that building. He never spoke to us about it. And he wasn't particularly close with Paul Carlick. Not that they weren't. Paul only was a tutor in UCD when he was doing the arts block, which was the next building on the square. in the mid-70s. So when he would come for site meetings, he would come in, he would take 2 students for their thesis for a year as well. He'd come into the studios because we were in Ulster Terrace in those days in St. Stephen's Green in the city centre. We weren't off out in the suburbs. The School of Architecture wasn't in the suburbs. It was a 10-minute walk from his site meeting. So no, Shane wasn't particularly close with Paul, and he never brought us to see that. But I can see why he would admire it because of its truth to material. You know, that everything's, even down to the librarian's desk, all the stuff that the librarians hated for a generation. I mean, Trinity fell out of love with that building for a long, long time. And its future was seriously at risk. I led a campaign through DoCoMoMo in about 2000 to kind of save the ground floor of it, which was going to be wrecked. And now the university loves it for its stubbornness, you know, just because you can't fuck it around. It tells you how you have to behave. Shane loves buildings that do that, by the way. Something he would really admire about that building is that it fixes the way you must behave. He has said about, I mean, I said to you earlier that he would have hung he did hang the librarian in CIT, Cork Institute of Technology, out to dry, because the librarian wanted more flexibility. He wanted the tables to be flexible, you know, because, you know, we might want to change things. And Shane's attitude was, you're not changing fucking anything in my life. You know, just because you have a new idea and I want more. This is how it is.
And Shane, so my project is about, or I guess the way I've originally framed it is to do with influence. And I know it's very broad, it's a broad term, but I do feel that Shane de Blackham embodies this somehow, because he comfortably talks about influences and they're also present in the work. You don't need to go very far to see them. You know, he says that in the office building on the corner.
Yeah, on Stephen's Green.
Yes, that.
Now, is this the Castle Street beside Christchurch, or is it on Stephen's Green, the white stone one?
The white stone, this white stone building. Yes. He says, you know, I cut out that corner on the ground floor, just like Louis Kahn cut out the corner on the Paul Mellon building in New Haven. So he very clearly and unambiguously acknowledges the reference. And I wonder, as a critic, you know, we could talk about it in relation to the Blackham and Marr work, but you could also reflect on it as a critic when you go to a building and when you look at a building for the first time. Is influence something that you look for?
No, for me it's not. But it will be obvious. It will be obvious in one of two ways. Either the architect himself or herself will have said to you, you know, we're thinking about, because a question I would always ask is, you know, what were you looking at? What were you thinking about? You know, any precursors to this project? Or you'll go and you'll see something yourself and you'll say, like for example, I said to you, I've been twice to Zumthor's, through the Klaus Capella, the field church in outside Cologne. And it was only the second time I went. First time I went, yeah, that was it. It was winter and there was ice on the floor and snow falling through the oculus. And then I came back a second time. When I came back the second time, I had been in Cologne first. And I was just, they were working on, like they have been for donkey's years, they were working on the facade of Cologne Cathedral. And I was looking at the facade of Cologne Cathedral, and there's all these little columns. and they're all bunched and paired and everything like that. I said, actually, the interior of Bruder Klaus Capella is a Rachel Whiteread rendering of the exterior of Cologne Cathedral. Zumthor has never written about that. I've never reviewed, I've never written about Bruder Klaus Capella. But I know that he was looking at the dirty white stone and all of those curvy shapes. And what he did then was he got the curvy trees and he burnt them out in the interior through the chimney of the oculus. And what you're left with is actually like the shell or the nest that you could have cast Cologne Cathedral from. Wonderful. Mm-hmm. I've never written about it, but I see.
Well, and I'm sure that Zumthor has never acknowledged that. So.
I'm sure he wouldn't. I mean, I've had lunch with him before that building was built after Bregenz. I had lunch with him one day, but I'm sure if I said that to him, he'd say, no. But the two things are, half an hour drive, 45-minute drive from each other. You can't arrive at the farm site without coming through Cologne Cathedral or Cologne railway station, and the cathedral is right beside it, the Hauptbahnhof. So, yes, influence. If I see it, I talk about it. If I was writing about Bruder Klaus Capella, of course I would be. One of the big things, one of my big discoveries would be that business.
Because you felt it. You experienced the connection.
You see the dirt on the stone of the cathedral. When you think about it and you look at it, is actually soot. It's from fire. So from fire, he makes, in his own project, he makes the inverse shape of it. So they're connected through fire as well. And I just think the way that these ideas can be transformed through centuries in a magical way that unless he had been dreaming there one day, looking at that, or sheltering from the rain, and was standing or having a cigarette, and he was standing up against the wall of the cathedral, just idle-minded.
But I've spoken to Neil McLaughlin, who said that when Zumthor was awarded a RIBA Gold Medal, he asked him after the lecture he gave, how come he hasn't mentioned a single other architect in this hour-long lecture, not a single external reference to his childhood memories and the way light hits the leaves, etc. And that Zumthor just refused to engage in a conversation about anyone else.
Yes, and I was on the jury. I was an expert at the time. I hadn't met him for lunch. Was when he won the Mies van der Rohe for Bregenz, and he came to Barcelona to give it, because you have to give a lecture. And he came to give a lecture. And he refused point blank to speak about Bregenz. He only spoke about Valls, which was, on paper at that stage, didn't. So he's awkward in that way. But your eyes can tell you more than. They'll tell you the truth. Shane is a huge influence in Irish architecture. There is nobody who is looked up to with the same awe as he. Not Grafton's, not O'Donnell Toomey, not McCullum Mervyn, not everybody looks up to Shane. When we were kind of starting out, before there was ever Group 91, there was an exhibition organized by Michael de Courcy, who died this day 40 years ago, my best friend. He was Yvonne Farrell's husband. And Michael was organizing an exhibition called to make making of Modern Street. It's not the one that the book was published about, that came 10 years later. And he was inviting people to make a project for in an art gallery that we would show it in the Municipal Art Gallery in Dublin, where he had been offered a room, and that everybody would look at a standard, typical Dublin plot, 6 to 8 meters wide, and try and make a contemporary house that might be able to make a street with the coherency of 18th century Dublin streets. Could you do it? You know, by designing a prototype for a 6 or 8 meter wide plot. And he invited, so Yvonne was in it, Yvonne himself worked together, Shea Cleary was in it, Shelley was in it, John did an entry in his own, Sheila did an entry in her own, Paul Keogh, Richard Chidlow, I did one with Michael Kelly. And Shane and John were asked, and John was all up for it. And Shane said, we're not playing with the kids anymore. That was 1980. So he just saw himself as a bit better than all of us kind of enthusiasts who were a little bit younger.
More as a father figure.
More as a father figure, but you know, he's only like 4 or 5
years, a generation.
Yvonne is 5 years older than me. Shelley is 4 years older than me. Shane is 5 years older than Yvonne. You know, I mean, it's almost like nothing.
Yeah, a generation away.
They're close friends. You know, they would have dinner regularly. They'd be compadres. But Shane, the big difference really is that Shane is the very last of a sequence of, he's the very last of a sequence of Irish architects who, well, Ray Ryan is the one exception, who looked to America.
Mm-hmm.
So, you know, you've got Andy Devan going to Frank Lloyd Wright. You've got Lewin Cuff going with Walter Gropius. You've got Shane going with Luke Kahn. You've got John going with Bob Venturi. Noel Dolly going with Luke Kahn. Peter Doyle going with Mies van der Rohe. Robin Walker going with Mies and with Corb. But everybody up to, if you like, 1970 went to America because that was where the future was. 1973, we joined the EEC as it was then, European Economic Community. And afterwards, all the architects go to Europe. So John and Sheila go to London and then, you know, take road trips around, bicycle trips around North Italy, looking at the work of Palladio. Michael McGarry, Sheila O'Donnell go to Berlin, work with Joseph Kleihuis in the IBA office. People go to Barcelona, and everything looks to Europe. So Shane is that dividing point between us. He's the last who looks to America, and the rest look to Europe. But he's, like him or loathe him, genius. That's what we probably all kind of say. And he.
No, absolutely. I think that's one thing I've discovered in all the different conversations I've had, the importance of the very Joycean notion of having to leave, go away, and then come back, hopefully. And that's something that I guess frames the Irish architectural tradition and culture.
It's also, you know, Alvar Aalto named his boat, you know. The prophet is not recognized in his own land.
Right.
You see that photograph of Aalto standing in his yacht?
No.
If you look at the name of the boat, it's Nemo Profete in Patria or something like that, whatever the correct inscription is, but it's something we Irish understand very well, that the prophet is never recognized in his own land.